In the hushed corridors of the London clinic, where royalty seeks refuge from both illness and the relentless gaze of the public eye, a truth was forming that would test the strength of a nation's beloved princess and the resolve of a family already weathered by centuries of triumph and tragedy. For months, the world had watched Catherine, Princess of Wales, navigate her cancer diagnosis with the grace and courage that had defined her years of royal service, her occasional public appearances offering hope to millions who prayed for her recovery, who saw in her resilience a reflection of their own struggles against illness and adversity. The carefully worded palace statements had spoken of treatment progressing well, of optimism and steady improvement, of a return to full duties that seemed tantalizingly close. And the public had clung to these assurances with desperate faith, needing to believe that their future queen would overcome this challenge, as she had overcome every other obstacle placed before her. But behind the ornate doors of private medical consultations, away from the cameras and the carefully managed public narrative, a different story was emerging, one that the doctors could no longer soften with diplomatic language or temper with false optimism. The latest scans revealed complications that no amount of positive thinking could overcome. Treatment response is that fell devastatingly short of what had been hoped, and a prognosis that would require not just courage, but a fundamental reimagining of what recovery might mean and what the future might hold. The medical team, led by specialists who had dedicated their careers to treating the most complex oncology cases, now faced the agonizing task of delivering news that would shatter the fragile hope that had sustained the princess and her family through the darkest months of treatment. On a gray morning in early January 2026, as frost clung to the windows of the private consultation room, and the city beyond continued its oblivious rush toward another ordinary day, the doctors prepared to speak words that would change everything. The princess sat with her husband beside her, their hands clasped together with the desperate strength of two people bracing for impact, and in the careful expressions of the medical professionals before them, they could already read the heartbreak that was coming. And once the truth was spoken, once the illusions of steady recovery were stripped away by clinical reality, nothing would ever be the same. The consultation had been scheduled for 9 o'clock on the morning of January 7th, in a private suite at the London clinic that had been secured against both press intrusion and the curious eyes of other patients who might recognize the future queen in their midst. Catherine had arrived early, as was her nature, dressed simply in navy trousers and a cream cashmere sweater, her appearance carefully composed despite the anxiety that had kept her awake through most of the previous night. William had canceled his scheduled engagements to be with her, his protective presence a shield against whatever was coming. Though both of them understood that some blows cannot be deflected, some truths cannot be softened by the presence of even the most devoted partner, they sat together in the waiting area, speaking little, their joined hands communicating what words could not: fear, love, determination, and the unspoken prayer that perhaps this time the news would be better than they feared. Dr. Amanda Sheffield, the lead oncologist whose expertise in treating complex cancers had made her one of the most respected specialists in Europe, entered the consultation room with a heaviness in her bearing that immediately told Catherine everything she needed to know. Behind her came Dr. James Whitmore, the surgical consultant, and Dr. Sarah Chen, the radiologist who had analyzed the most recent imaging studies. And in their collective expressions, Catherine saw not the cautious optimism that had characterized previous meetings, but something far more troubling, a profound professional sadness that transcended the usual clinical detachment. "Your Royal Highness, Sir," Dr. Sheffield began, her voice steady but weighted with the burden of what she was about to reveal, and Catherine felt William's hand tighten around hers as they both braced for the impact of words they had been dreading since the moment the original diagnosis had been delivered. Dr. Sheffield spread a series of scan images across the desk before them, the black and white imagery meaningless to untrained eyes, but clearly significant to the medical team, whose faces reflected grave concern. "The latest imaging studies show that the cancer has not responded to treatment in the way we had hoped," she said, choosing her words with the careful precision of someone who understood that every syllable would be remembered, analyzed, replayed in the sleepless nights ahead. Despite the aggressive chemotherapy protocol and your remarkable tolerance of the treatment regimen, we're seeing progression rather than regression. The primary tumor has not reduced in size as we anticipated, and more concerning, we've identified new areas of involvement that suggest the disease has spread. Despite our best interventions, the words landed like physical blows, each one dismantling the fragile structure of hope that Catherine had been carefully building. Through months of grueling treatment, Catherine's face remained composed, years of royal training allowing her to maintain her dignity, even as she felt the ground shifting beneath her. But her free hand moved instinctively to her throat, a gesture of vulnerability that betrayed the terror she was working so hard to contain. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt throughout her entire body. "What are we looking at now?" The question hung in the air, and in the brief pause before Dr. Sheffield responded, Catherine lived an entire lifetime of fear, imagining her children growing up without her, seeing William's future stretching ahead without her beside him, confronting the possibility that all her plans, her work, her vision for the kind of queen she wanted to become might be cut short by an enemy she could not charm, could not negotiate with, could not overcome through sheer force of will and dedication to duty. Dr. Sheffield's response was delivered with compassionate directness. Understanding that false hope would be crueler than difficult truth, it means, Your Royal Highness, that we need to fundamentally reconsider our treatment approach and, more importantly, our expectations for recovery. The cancer is more aggressive and more resistant to conventional treatment than we initially assessed. We're not looking at a straightforward path to remission anymore. Instead, we're facing a long-term management scenario controlling the disease rather than curing it, maximizing quality of life while pursuing more experimental treatment options, and preparing for a future that will require significant adjustments to your duties and daily life. The clinical language could not disguise the devastating reality. Catherine's cancer was winning, and the confident predictions of full recovery that had sustained her through the worst of treatment had been replaced by the uncertain territory of chronic illness and managed decline. The weight of betrayal filled the air, not betrayal by the doctors, who had clearly done everything within their power and expertise, but betrayal by Catherine's own body, by the cells that had turned against her, by the cruel reality that grace and courage and royal duty could not overcome biological processes. Indifferent to titles and public affection, William, who had remained silent while the medical details were explained, finally spoke, his voice rough with barely contained emotion. "What are her chances? Please, just tell us plainly, what are we actually facing here?" Dr. Sheffield met his eyes with the kind of steady compassion that comes from years of delivering impossible news to desperate families, and when she spoke, her words shook him to his core. "With aggressive continued treatment and some promising experimental protocols we'd like to pursue, we're looking at managing this as a chronic condition. But I won't mislead you, the 5-year survival statistics for this type of progression are not encouraging. We measure success differently now in quality months and years, in stability rather than cure, in making whatever time we have as full and meaningful as possible." The truth was that warning signs had been appearing for months, subtle indicators that the medical team had observed with growing concern, but had initially attributed to the normal challenges of aggressive cancer treatment. In early September 2025, during what was supposed to be a routine follow-up examination, Catherine had mentioned persistent fatigue that seemed disproportionate to her activity level, a bone-deep exhaustion that wasn't relieved by rest, and that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Dr. Sheffield had ordered additional blood work, which showed markers that were concerning, but not yet definitive, suggesting that the treatment might need adjustment, but not necessarily indicating the kind of fundamental failure that would later become apparent. Catherine had been reassured that fatigue was normal, that her body was fighting hard, and she had accepted this explanation with relief, grateful for any interpretation that allowed her to maintain hope. By late October, new symptoms had emerged that could not be so easily dismissed. Pain that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage with standard medications. A persistent cough that had initially been attributed to seasonal illness, but that continued long after other symptoms resolved. and a subtle but noticeable weight loss despite efforts to maintain proper nutrition. Eek! The shadow that had fallen over their family's future. Catherine had excused herself quietly, retreating to her bathroom, where she allowed herself 15 minutes of silent, wrenching tears before washing her face, reapplying minimal makeup, and returning to help Charlotte finish her homework as though nothing had happened. Her determination to protect her children from the full weight of what was happening created an additional burden of performance. She smiled when they were present, maintained routines and normalcy, discussed future plans and summer holiday possibilities, as though her prognosis had not fundamentally changed, all while carrying the terrible knowledge that these might be among the last ordinary moments they would share. With William, she could be somewhat more honest, but even with him she found herself tempering her despair, offering reassurance when she felt anything but reassured, maintaining strength because she could see how much he was struggling and she could not bear to make his burden heavier by revealing the full depth of her fear and grief. The physical challenges that came with both the advancing cancer and the continued aggressive treatment, now modified to include more experimental protocols with uncertain outcomes, added another layer of difficulty to her daily life. The fatigue was no longer something she could push through with sheer determination. It demanded acknowledgement and accommodation. Pain management became a central concern, requiring careful calibration of medications that would control her symptoms without leaving her too foggy to engage with her children or participate in the limited public duties she was still desperately trying to fulfill. She endured in silence the indignities of illness, the ways her body was failing her, the loss of control over basic physical functions, all while trying to maintain some semblance of the grace and dignity that had defined her public persona. The breaking point came not in a single, dramatic moment but in a gradual accumulation of realities that could no longer be denied or managed. By late January, Catherine's condition had deteriorated to the point where the experimental treatments were causing side effects that rivaled the disease itself, and the medical team had to make difficult decisions about whether continuing such aggressive intervention was actually serving Catherine's best interests or simply prolonging suffering without meaningful benefit. On January 28th, during another consultation at the London clinic, Dr. Sheffield raised the question that no one wanted to address, but that could no longer be avoided: whether it was time to shift from aggressive treatment aimed at extending life at any cost to palliative care focused on quality of life and comfort. The conversation took place in the same private consultation room where the devastating news had first been delivered 3 weeks earlier. But this time the atmosphere was different, heavier, more resigned, tinged with the acknowledgement that they had entered a new phase where the goals were changing. "We need to talk honestly about what we're trying to achieve with treatment going forward," Dr. Sheffield said gently, her compassionate directness once again cutting through the possibility of comforting euphemisms. "The experimental protocols we've been pursuing are causing significant side effects, and we're not seeing the response we had hoped for. At some point, and I'm not saying we're necessarily there yet, but we need to discuss it. We have to weigh quality of life against quantity and consider whether continuing to fight with every available weapon is actually serving your best interests or causing unnecessary suffering." Catherine, who had been growing visibly thinner and more fragile despite all efforts to maintain her health, sat very still as the implications of this conversation became clear. "You're talking about giving up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And in those words William heard not accusation, but a desperate plea for someone to tell her that wasn't what was happening. Dr. Sheffield shook her head firmly. "I'm talking about changing our definition of success. I'm talking about making sure that whatever time you have, and we will continue fighting to make that, as long as possible, is spent living rather than simply enduring treatment. I'm talking about prioritizing moments with your family, experiences that matter to you, over hours spent feeling miserable from medications that might extend your life by weeks or months, but at significant cost to how you feel during that time." The weight of betrayal filled the air, not betrayal by the doctors, who were clearly trying to guide them through impossible choices with compassion and wisdom, but betrayal by hope itself, by the narrative of cancer as something that could be overcome through courage and determination, by the implicit promise that doing everything right would lead to recovery. William, who had been Catherine's unwavering source of strength throughout her entire illness, finally broke, his carefully maintained composure crumbling as the reality of what they were facing became undeniable. "So what are you telling us? How long?" The question that had been hovering unspoken over every conversation since January 7th was finally asked directly, and Dr. Sheffield's response, delivered with profound gentleness, shattered any remaining illusions. "If we continue aggressive treatment, possibly 12 to 18 months, though the quality of those months is uncertain. If we shift to palliative care focused on comfort, perhaps 6 to 12 months, but with significantly better quality of life. These are estimates, not certainties. Every patient is different, and Catherine is young and strong. But I won't mislead you with false hope. We're talking about months, not years." The silence that followed was absolute, a stillness so profound that the distant sounds of London traffic and hospital activity seemed to come from another world entirely. Catherine sat with tears streaming down her face, no longer trying to maintain her composure, her hands trembling in William's grip. "I'm 43 years old," she said finally, her voice breaking with the weight of grief and disbelief. "My children are 12, 9, and 6. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to have decades ahead of me. I was supposed to be queen. I was supposed to see my children grow up, get married, have families of their own. How am I supposed to accept that all of that is being taken away?" The terrible cleverness of it that cancer had chosen her, had struck during what should have been her prime years, had disrupted not just her life, but the carefully planned future of the monarchy itself, made the unfairness of it almost unbearable. Dr. Sheffield and her colleagues gave Catherine and William time to absorb this reality, to grieve together in the privacy of the consultation room, before gently guiding them toward the practical decisions that now needed to be made. There were questions about whether Catherine wanted to pursue any further experimental treatments or shift entirely to palliative care, discussions about pain management and quality of life priorities, conversations about how and when to tell the children, decisions about public disclosure and managing the inevitable media attention. Each question forced them to confront the reality they were desperately wanting to deny, to make choices that acknowledged Catherine's terminal diagnosis and accepted that their focus now had to shift from cure to comfort, from fighting at all costs to making the most of limited time. Before they left the consultation room that day, Catherine made one request that revealed both her courage and her devastation. "I want to talk to the children myself. I need to be the one to tell them, in my own words, in my own way. They need to hear it from me while I'm still strong enough to help them understand, to reassure them that they'll be okay even when I'm not here anymore." The strength required to make that decision, to voluntarily have what might be the hardest conversation of her life, spoke to the kind of mother Catherine had always been: protective, honest, determined to prepare her children for reality rather than shield them with comforting lies. The truth was spoken, and there was no going back. The future that Catherine and William had been building together, that they had imagined extending decades into the future, had been suddenly and brutally shortened. And now they faced the excruciating task of learning how to live and love and parent in the shadow of approaching loss. In the weeks that followed the devastating consultation, a different kind of courage emerged, not the courage of fighting illness, but the courage of facing mortality with grace. Catherine made the decision to shift primarily to palliative care, choosing quality of life over aggressive treatments that offered minimal hope of extension, at significant cost to how she felt. This decision was not giving up, as she had initially feared, but rather a radical reorienting of priorities toward what truly mattered: time with William and the children, moments of normalcy and joy, opportunities to create final memories that would have to last her family a lifetime. The conversation with George, Charlotte, and Louis took place on a quiet Sunday afternoon in early February at Adelaide Cottage, in the comfortable sitting room where they gathered as a family. Away from the formality of palace life, Catherine had planned carefully what she would say, how she would balance honesty with age-appropriate explanation, how she would acknowledge the sadness of what was happening while also reassuring them. that they would be loved and cared for no matter what. William sat beside her, his presence a steady anchor as she told their children that Mummy's illness was not getting better. The